Thank you for joining us, whether you're watching online or on TV. I'm Farah Nasser. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is set to provide his daily COVID-19 address from outside Rideau Cottage in about 15 minutes. March 11th, 2 months ago, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. So 2 months later, let's look at where the numbers stand globally. As of today, more than 4.2 million people have tested positive for coronavirus. Of those, 1.5 million have recovered and 285,000 people have died. More than a third of the world's known cases are right now in the United States. Let's take a closer look at where the numbers are in Canada, and specifically in terms of new cases. So efforts to slow the spread appear to be working, with provinces west of Ontario reporting single or double-digit cases. In Ontario, 308 new cases were reported. That's just coming to us moments ago, one day after reporting the lowest growth in new cases since March. Quebec, it is still the hotspot for this virus in Canada. Nova Scotia is the only East Coast province that is reporting any new cases today. Meantime, Ottawa this morning unveiled a new program, and it's an aid program for large businesses that have been hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. Finance Minister Bill Morneau and Industry Minister Navdeep Bains laid out the details in Toronto this morning. It is dubbed the largest employer emergency financing facility. The initiative will allow big companies to access additional liquidity. That is to keep their operations going. Now, it's aimed at companies with revenues of $300 million or more. And this plan, this is important, it comes with a series of strict conditions. For example, companies must pledge their commitment to environmental sustainability.
The money's intended for firms that need it. It's not low-cost lending for those who don't need it, nor is it to rescue companies that were already facing insolvency before this crisis. It's there to make sure that companies that came into this crisis on strong footing get to the other side and can rebound quickly. These companies provide jobs for millions of Canadians. Canada needs them to stay strong through this crisis.
The ministers also announced that Ottawa is expanding the business credit availability program to include mid-sized companies with larger financing needs. Our global news correspondents are standing by with the very latest. We have Mike Drolet joining us from Toronto because Ontario begins to slowly reopen today. Raquel Fletcher joins us from Quebec, where we saw a sight we have not seen in months. Thousands of students back in class this morning. And Chief Political Correspondent David Akin joins us, of course, from Ottawa with more on this morning's announcement. David, I'm going to start with you. And this one is interesting because it's like a parent asking a child, let me see your room before I give you this allowance, in terms of the strict conditions these companies have to have. We heard one, it was environmental sustainability. What else do these companies have to live up to get this money?
Well, among others, and that's a very good metaphor, by the way, Farah, I like that. One of the other sort of conditions for keeping the room clean, essentially for these companies, is if you've ever been convicted of tax evasion, you're not getting any federal help. That's important. And politically, that's an issue that Quebec has seemed to raise more so than any other jurisdiction. Quebec voters seem to be more sensitive about tax evasion and tax evaders getting federal help. So that's one. You can't really have access to any other credit. In other words, if your bank, again, this is big companies we're talking about here, if your bank is still lending you money and you still have lines of credit you can draw on at the bank, you keep doing that. The federal government is ready to step in with loans or guaranteed loans only when essentially all other options are gone. And here's a really good example. The oil and gas sector, and we know for months that the oil and gas sector has been saying it needs specific sectoral help just for the oil and gas sector. There's a lot of big oil and gas firms that have a line of credit or a loan with their bank, and their credit is good so long as certain conditions or covenants are still in place. One of those covenants, for example, might be so long as the price of a barrel of oil maintains a certain level. Well, we know that the price of a barrel of oil has dropped. It's right downhill. Production levels have had to be cut back. That may, for some companies, that may put them in violation of their credit agreements. As a result, they can no longer get any credit from the bank. So there's an example of a firm that was sailing along until this pandemic hit, and then the world sort of fell apart for them. So this may be an opportunity for an oil and gas firm to go to the federal government and say, listen, we need to have help from, it's called the LEAF, Large Enterprise Emergency Financing.
All these acronyms.
LEFF, LEAF. What, there are acronyms everywhere here, Farah. So this company may come, but you're right. Among the things this oil firm may have to sign on to is some reporting on their meeting climate goals and on sustainability. Why would the government do this? It's all politics. I can tell you that inside the cabinet, the Liberal cabinet, let alone the caucus, there's been a debate. Bill Morneau, the finance minister, and Chrystia Freeland, the deputy prime minister, they've been seen by the oil patch as, quote, the adults in the room. That's the phrase I've heard from sources in the oil patch. They've been pushing for support for our oil and gas players just this way. But there's other ministers, Stephen Guilbeault, the heritage minister, lead among them, a Montreal MP, used to be a Greenpeace campaigner. He doesn't want any money going to the oil and gas sector. So this perhaps is the trade-off. Okay, the oil and gas sector can have access to credit, but it's got to meet some certain environmental reporting. There'll be other sectors as well. Airlines might want to take advantage of this sector. Now, Air Canada still does have a lot of room that it can borrow from its banks, but if it runs out of that credit, it could come to the federal government. And another big sector, retailers. Think of national clothing retail chains, for example, that you find in malls. They've had to pay that rent to their tenant at whatever mall it might be, to their landlord at whatever mall it might be, but they've got no revenue coming in. They may need some bridge financing. So the whole point of this program is we want these big companies to still be there once this pandemic lifts. They have some capital costs that they'll still have to maintain. Mm-hmm. This is the help for them. But Farah, you're quite right. It's like saying, you keep your room clean, then I'll give you your allowance.
All right, David Akin, thanks so much. We're going to keep you on standby because I want to talk about politics soon, too, in terms of the Conservative leadership race. But we're going to first go to Raquel in schools. And before I do that, Quebec, it remains the hardest hit province. There are well over half of the country's cases of COVID-19 in that province and almost 3,000 deaths. Now, despite all of that, Quebec is leading the provinces in reopening as many students return to class today. Just to be specific, that's outside the Greater Montreal area. But with more on that, Raquel Fletcher joins us now. And Raquel, how did that look this morning?
Hi, Farah. Well, as you mentioned, it is outside of the Greater Montreal region, and I just want to focus on that for a few seconds here because the reopening of Montreal has been pushed back till at least May 25th, and if the situation doesn't get better, it could be pushed back much farther than that. And, going back to school and daycare has been a very controversial decision. A lot of people not agreeing with the Legault government on this issue, but the government insists and has repeated that the situation is very much concentrated in the Greater Montreal region. Those numbers of cases that we see keep going up every day. That is very much in the Montreal region. The rest of Quebec, they tell us, is doing rather well, and that's why they want to send elementary school students back to school. Now, it isn't mandatory. Parents can keep their kids at home if they don't feel like it's safe. And also daycares. They want to slowly, gradually open in the regions of Quebec that aren't facing quite the situation as Montreal is. So there are sort of two universes happening in Quebec. There's the Montreal region and then the rest of Quebec.
Before I let you go, and I wanted to know about the Cargill plant, because there's another Cargill plant now that's shutting down after another outbreak. Tell us more about that plant in Quebec.
So after the situation in Alberta, there were 64 employees who tested positive in that Cargill plant. It is going to close later this week. They tell us that they need to process the product that is there, and then they're going to close. We don't know for how long. As far as we know, we don't know how serious the cases are, but definitely raising alarm bells about our food production and how autonomous we are in food production and how this works. And of course, the Quebec Premier one of the first things that he said at the beginning of this crisis is, as a province, and I don't think it's just Quebec, I think it's, other Canadian provinces looking at this as well, is where do we get our food from? What do we import? How does that affect us in a crisis? Very unfortunate that this cargo plant has had to close, but I think it will create sort of a climate, sort of a situation politically where we start to look at, how do we change the way that we are producing food for our citizens?
Certainly. That's in a lot of sectors when it comes to supply chain and food. Thanks for that. That is Raquel Fletcher in Quebec City. Quebec, of course, not the only province moving forward with reopening today. Let's bring in our Mike Drolet. He joins us from Toronto. Mike, Ontario allowing more businesses to reopen today. What's that going to look like?
Well, clearly, Doug Ford is letting the leash off a little bit for the economy just to breathe a little bit. Over the weekend, it was hardware stores and garden centers, and today it's stores with a street front entrance. So then it leaves malls out of the picture, but it's just so then people can, as we've seen in many cases, drive up, pick up their goods from the outside in very controlled situations. So those are going to be opened again today. 500 provincial parks will be open today, more towards the end of the week, although they're only going to be open for the day, as well as more construction sites will be allowed to operate. Before it was just sort of larger construction sites. Now it's going to be below grade apartments, condominiums, that sort of thing. Clearly the message from Doug Ford is that is for business to get ready. He's not saying exactly when the rest of the economy will reopen. He is asking to extend the state of emergency in Ontario, as you know, until May 31st, which he'll ask in legislature this week. But what he's going to be asking for then is just more power to be able to say when the rest of the economy can open, when other stores, when other businesses can get going, although with very strict measures, because as we know, the business world that we're going to be seeing in the coming months is not the one that we saw, 3-4 months ago.
Certainly, Bay Street, which is, the financial core of this country, is going to look very different and not so much of hustle bustle that we've seen. Now, he wants to open the economy slowly, the Premier, that is, Premier Doug Ford. But the province's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Mike, still concerned about how this virus is spreading. Tell us more.
Well, considering we're having far fewer flights coming into the country, it makes sense that the total number of cases that within the country that are being transmitted from people who have traveled in the last 14 days is only at 7%. 22% of all the cases had contact with another confirmed case. And the key number is this: 36% had community exposure. And that's the concern. That's why there's real hesitancy to be able to open up everything quickly and open everything right away, because we're still getting the cases transmitted from people going out and not being conscious of this 2-meter rule and wearing PPE, gloves, masks, et cetera, And then even more specific, a more specific number is 55% of all new cases. That's all new transmissions are from community transmission. So we're being careful, obviously. And the Chief Medical Officer of Health says, you know what, let's be conscious of this. Let's understand that what the numbers mean. It means that if you go out and somebody else isn't being careful and they possibly have COVID-19, that's how you're going to get it. And that's likely how we're going to be seeing this evolve over the next couple of months. And they want to be able to avoid a large second wave. And the only way we're going to do that is to stay diligent with this 2-meter rule.
And contact tracing and testing, where Ontario is still behind. So that's something that we are watching carefully. Thanks for that, Mike Drolet. I'm going to bring back David Akin because we should talk about this. The Conservative leadership race, it hits a benchmark this week. That's the cutoff to join the party. So where does the race stand right now, David?
That's right. So if you want to vote for the next leader of the Conservative Party, you got to sign up by May the 11th. That's this Friday. The vote's not till August 21st. But if you want to ballot, this is the week. And so this is the big push for all the candidates. There's 4, of course. And I think before this race started, a lot of folks thought that Peter MacKay was going to run away with it. He ain't running away with it. It's a very competitive race. I'd say he's still the leader, but Aaron O'Toole is hot on his trail and is hoping to sort of steal this really from Peter MacKay. Last week, the Conservative National Caucus, that's MPs and senators, really started to pick sides, and a lot of them A lot of them had previously gone with McKay. He was early out the gate with about 40 MPs on his side. But last week, Aaron O'Toole picked up a bunch, and he picked up some from Quebec. And that is seen as where O'Toole had to make some inroads in French Canada. McKay, his battle really is in Western Canada. He's got to pick up more support from voters there. So this is a big week for the leadership campaign. One other bit of news this morning, the National Council of the Conservative Party has made some decisions to suspend this year's Conservative National Convention. So the plan was there was going to be a new leader elected in late summer. Then in the fall, there was going to be a gathering of Conservatives, a national convention. They'd have their new leader, figure out some policies, be ready for an election. That convention is now suspended. It's been put on hold. They hope to have it next spring. And this, I know it's, COVID-19 is probably more important than partisan politics, but Farah, you can't believe the number of senior people in the Conservative Party, MPs and planners, who are convinced that Justin Trudeau is going to pull the fall and have another election just less than, or about a year after the last one. They've been looking at Trudeau's poll numbers. His approval ratings are very strong. The Conservatives right now in a bit of disarray, still looking for a leader, and they think the Liberals are going to take advantage of this and try to have an election. Personally, I'm telling you, this is what the opposition thinks right now. They need to get prepared for an election they think may be called by the Liberals this fall.
Wow, that would make sense in terms of the numbers. Even the provincial premiers, we're seeing that they are seeing high numbers as well in terms of approval.
That's right. And this is one of the reasons I don't see perhaps an election happening this fall, in the sense that the Liberals want to call one. The Liberals would only call one to try to win a majority. But I think as they might look to win seats in Ontario, this time around, I don't think Justin Trudeau could campaign against Ford. He did so with some success last fall. But right now, Doug Ford is more popular than Justin Trudeau. He's a lot of voters, even those who
David,
may not
I'm just
be
going to interrupt you. We're going to have to put politics aside, and the Prime Minister now speaking. Thanks.
Good morning. I'd like to begin today by recognizing that this is National Nurses Week. Nurses are the heart and soul of our healthcare system. Every day they do incredible work to keep Canadians healthy, and the way they've stepped up to support people during this pandemic speaks to their compassion, resilience, and dedication. To all the nurses out there, thank you so much for going above and beyond, not just these days, but every day. Je veux commencer ce matin en soulignant la Semaine nationale des soins. I'd like to start this morning by underlining National Nursing Week. Nurses are at the heart of our healthcare system, and every day they do an extraordinary job of keeping us healthy, and the way that they're supporting people during this current pandemic demonstrates their compassion, their resilience, and their devotion. So to all nurses everywhere, thank you for everything that you do, not only now, but all the time. Since the beginning, our response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been driven by three fundamental objectives. The first is to keep Canadians safe and ensure we take every possible step to protect our most vulnerable citizens. This work continues daily, guided by our best doctors and medical experts, and it drives every move we make. The second is to protect individuals, workers, and families from the worst financial impacts of this pandemic, so you can put food on the table and cover your bills while staying safe. We're doing that with programs such as the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, the increase in the Canada Child Benefit this month, and the enhanced GST tax credit, among other measures. And thirdly, we are helping Canadian businesses through this extraordinary time, including for-profit, not-for-profit, and charitable enterprises, to ensure that workers across Canada can keep their jobs, so we can come roaring back after this difficult time is behind us. Aujourd'hui, j'annonce la prochaine phase de nos mesures. Today, I'm announcing the next phase of our support for businesses that collectively employ millions of Canadians, and that were subjected to huge losses because of the pandemic. We're going to widen the a business credit availability program that was created to allow small businesses to remain healthy, and in order to include also mid-sized businesses that need more liquidity. Export Development Canada and the Canada Development Bank will be working with lenders from the private sector in order to increase access to capital by several tens of millions of dollars for Canadian businesses in all sectors of the economy and in all regions of the country. We'll also implement the large employer emergency financing facility to help the large employers who cannot obtain funds in the usual way to get through the crisis. But I want to be clear here. This is a bridge financing facility, not a gift. We're providing support to these large employers in order to protect millions of jobs throughout the country. Our approach is based on several basic principles. First, we want to avoid that the businesses go bankrupt. The objective of this credit is not to finance businesses in difficulty or to permit restructuring. We do not intend also to provide low interest loans to businesses that don't need it. Second, we will be fair. This financing will be accessible to all sectors and in all provinces and territories. And third, we will protect people's jobs. That's what's most important. Businesses that receive this assistance have to make certain commitments and respect them. For example, maintain jobs and investments, respect collective agreements, and also their obligations with regard to the pension plans, and make commitments with regard to the environment. More precisely on that latter, there will be firm limits to dividends and purchasing buybacks of actions and the salary of leaders in order to fight against tax avoidance or tax evasion. The businesses will have to share their full financial structure when they present a request for financing. I am announcing the next phase of our support for enterprises that collectively employ millions of Canadians and are experiencing unprecedented losses due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We are expanding the business credit availability program put in place to keep small businesses solvent to mid-sized companies with a greater need for capital. Export Development Canada and the Business Development Bank of Canada will work with private sector lenders to free up access to capital in the tens of millions for Canadian companies in every industry and in all regions across Canada. At the same time, we are establishing a large employer emergency financing facility to provide bridge financing for our largest employers if they are unable to obtain financing through other means. But let me be clear, these are bridge loans, not bailouts. Just as we are finding ways to support small and medium-sized businesses, we'll provide loans to the largest enterprises to help them weather the storm and protect the millions of jobs they provide across Canada. In providing this support, we will be guided by several basic principles. The first is to avoid bankruptcies. Our purpose is to keep large Canadian companies on their feet and protect the millions of jobs they provide. The goal here is not to fix pre-existing insolvencies or restructurings, nor is it to provide low-cost lending to companies that don't need it. Second, we will be fair. Financing will be accessible to every industry sector in a way that is consistent in every province and territory right across Canada. And critically, we will protect workers and hold companies accountable. This is fundamental. Any company that receives this support will be expected to make and keep certain commitments. Those include maintaining jobs and investment, respecting collective agreements and pension obligations, and environmental and climate commitments. In particular, there will be strict limits on dividends, share buybacks, and executive compensation. To stand strong against tax avoidance and tax evasion, we will require companies to share with us their complete financial structure as they apply for funding. With this program, we're taking a bold step. Ideally, private sector lenders are adequate for the needs of large businesses. But in an extraordinary situation when that isn't always enough, we must act to prevent massive harm to Canadian workers and families and the Canadian economy. We will not allow millions of people to lose their livelihoods because of unprecedented events beyond their control. Finally, as we continue to work on plans to reopen, I want to say this. Please let caution and medical advice be your guides. We are all anxious to see life go back to something that looks more like normal. But we're not out of the woods yet, and we cannot squander the sacrifices we've made over the past 2 months. So when in doubt, if you can, stay home. Avoid gatherings. Wash your hands frequently and thoroughly, and maintain 2 meters distance from everyone else. This is how we will keep fellow Canadians who can't stay home and those working on the front lines safe. I'm now happy to take your questions.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Premier ministre. On va commencer la période de questions par le téléphone aujourd'hui. Opérateur, c'est à vous.
Operator, over to you.
Thank you. Merci. First question, Kate Bolongaro from Bloomberg. Line open.
Hi, Prime Minister. I have a question regarding LEAF. Companies will have to publish how their business ties into the government's sustainability objectives. And I'm wondering, will oil and gas companies be able to fulfill this requirement given the sector's contribution to Canada's CO2 emissions?
We have seen many oil and gas companies make commitments already around net zero by 2050, around understanding that we need to do better in terms of reducing emissions both as a country and as a sector. That's why we're expecting them to put forward a frame within which they will demonstrate their commitments to reducing emissions and fighting climate change. Okay. We
expect everybody to do their share to fight against climate change. We've already seen several large companies from the petroleum sector put forward plans to reach carbon net zero by 2050 and to fight against climate change by reducing their emissions. And we expect that any business that seeks access to this financing give us a plan to show us their solution.
And another key part of these conditions are limitations on executive pay. But what mechanisms are you concretely and pragmatically going to put in place to ensure the appropriate level of executive pay that comes out of this fund, and what is the right amount in your opinion?
We will be sharing the details to come, but the principle is very clear. If a company wants to access this public financing, this taxpayer-funded financing for large employers in order to protect employees across the country, the money has to go to support those employers and not high-paid executives. That's a condition that they will have to abide by if they want to access this financing. Okay. We
expect that the assistance provided by taxpayer to large companies be there to help workers, not senior managers. So we expect that any company that wants to apply to this financing mechanism make clear commitments to not give more money to its senior executives. Next question, operator. Next question, Raymond Fillon, TVA News. Good day, Mr. Prime Minister. I'd like to come back to what you said on Saturday, where you said you were very worried about citizens in Montreal in answer to a question about the deconfinement being operated in Quebec. Could you tell us just what is causing this worry? Answer. I think that there's cause for concern throughout the country. People are worried about their parents and their grandparents that are in long-term care facilities. As Prime Minister, I'm concerned for the whole country, and that is why we're taking unprecedented measures to protect Canadians and invest in the economy. And as a Quebecer and member for the riding of Papineau in Montreal, I have a responsibility to worry also for the citizens in my riding. And I'm there not only to worry, but to work in collaboration with the various levels of governments. We're working quite well with the Legault government to ensure that we are achieving protection for Quebecers and all Canadians from COVID-19.
I think as we all are, there are things to be concerned about these days. Canadians across the country are worried for their families, for their loved ones, for their communities. As Prime Minister, I'm worried about people across the country. As Member of Parliament for Papineau and a Quebecer, I'm also worried about my fellow Quebecers and the citizens in my riding. That's why it is so important that we continue to work with the Quebec government on our shared goal of ensuring that people get through this as best we possibly can, and we will continue to work hand in hand with the Quebec government on exactly that.
En suivi, Ray.
My question was specifically on deconfinement. As an elected official and leader, are you 100% comfortable with what's going on? For example, school reopening today. Answer, it's very open to respect the principles that have been laid down and to ensure that at each step that we have enough protections in place and the capability of answering to a possible resurgence of COVID-19. So I respect fully Quebec's choices, and we will continue working with them to ensure that the decisions they make on matters of reopening will be as safe as possible by providing more personal protection equipment, by ensuring that the testing capability is there and be their partner in time of need.
As we move forward, the role of the federal government will be to support provinces in their reopening plans. We will be there to help them make sure that there are enough testing for their levels, that there is more PPE arriving, that we're putting in place measures to follow the guidelines agreed to by all provinces and the federal government on necessary prerequisites to opening.
Thank you. Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Althea Raj, Huffington Post.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Thanks. Do you believe the provinces and territories are currently testing enough people for COVID-19?
I think we need to do more testing right across the country. Last week, we hit our 1 millionth test for Canadians, but there's a lot more to do. We know that as the economy starts to reopen, it's going to be more important to ensure that we have strong testing protocols right across the country. We need to increase the numbers. We've managed to support the provinces on obtaining reagents, on obtaining equipment for it. We need to see more lab capacity opening up, which many provinces have already done in turning to universities and private labs. There's lots more to do on testing, and we need to make sure we're working on that all together. Je pense que c'est nécessaire de faire encore plus de
Yes, I think it is necessary to do even more testing. Last week, we did our millionth test, but we have to do yet more. It's an essential part of any reopening plan for the economy. So from the federal government point of view, we will there to accompany provinces, help them do even more testing. We think it's essential for the next phases.
Thank you. So as we begin to reopen the economy and ease restrictions, should testing be available to all who want it?
I think as we've seen throughout this situation, there are very different factors and different situations on the ground across the country. The situation in Prince Edward Island is very different than the situation in British Columbia, which is different from Nunavut and different from Ontario or Quebec. Obviously, every jurisdiction needs to make determinations about what the right and maximal level of testing is that they need, but we will be there as a federal government to encourage them to do as much as they possibly can and make sure that we're helping them access the material needed to do just that.
Thank you. Operator, la dernière question.
Merci. Thank you. De Hélène Buzetti, Le Devoir.
Hélène Buzatier, Le Devoir newspaper. Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. Grade schools and daycare centres are opening in Quebec. Their employer, the government of Quebec, believes that the work environment is safe, but there are yet teachers and educators who are refusing to return to work. Should these people be continuing to receive the CERB? Very important question. We have to ensure that people are safe when they return to work. And that's what we're working on with the province of Quebec, to ensure that not only do they have the rules that they themselves set up, but also the necessary equipment to reassure people. Now, I understand that people be worried throughout the country as we start reopening and deconfining. It's very important for employers to be able to reassure their employees that the environment is safe for them. Follow up? Yes, Mr. Trudeau, you didn't really answer the question I put. There are more and more provincial premiers that are worried about the fact that the CERB is dissuasive. Brian Callister, Mr. Legault, and Ford have mentioned that. Can you guarantee provinces that Ottawa will not pay the CERB to workers who could return to work but to refuse to do so? The CERB is there to support people who can't work because of COVID-19. Our priority is to protect people and their families. The CERB exists in order to precisely to support such persons. So it's the responsibility of provinces to ensure that return to work is done safely. We will be there to help them. But what's important in all of that is to ensure that families have the necessary support and that people feel safe.
I think it's extremely important to remember that we are still very much in an emergency phase right now, where most of the economy is being in extreme slowdown right now, because we have to make sure we're preventing the spread of COVID-19. The Canada Emergency Response Benefit is there to ensure that people can stay safe and support their families at the same time. As people look at going back to work, it will be the responsibility of the employers to demonstrate that situations are safe for people to return to work. The role of the federal government is to support the provinces and other employers in that work, but it's also our role to make sure that families and people are supported to be able to stay safe during this pandemic.
Hi, Prime Minister. Tom Parry with CBC. In your opening address, you talked about this new loan program. You talked about tax avoidance and tax evasion. I get that you don't want to give a loan to a company that's breaking the law to evade taxes, but on tax avoidance, what if you open up the books of a company applying for a loan, you find out they've been doing everything they can to pay as little tax as possible? Do they get a loan?
I think Canadians expect companies that get support from public dollars to have been responsible around paying their fair share of taxes. And certainly if we see situations where someone is engaged in aggressive tax avoidance, we will be putting in conditions or working out a way with them to ensure that they pay their fair share of taxes. Okay. Je pense que tout le monde s'attend à ce que
I think that everyone expects that major companies pay their fair share of taxes. And if we look at their financial structure closely and we see that they haven't really paid their fair share of taxes in Canada, we will require that they bring about changes in order to receive this new assistance.
A lot of oil and gas companies have signed on to net zero commitments. So with the climate requirements in this new loan package, are you trying to freeze out companies that have not made those kinds of commitments?
On the contrary, I think people around the world in financial markets have seen that managing risk is extremely important. We're seeing it with COVID-19, and before we invest in a company, I think it's appropriate to look at what their risk mitigation strategies are. People will be asking about what their risk mitigation strategies for pandemics are as they invest in companies going forward. But we also know that climate change represents a significant significant risk to companies' bottom line as well. So it is perfectly natural for an investor, including public investors like the Government of Canada, to be asking people how they are going to manage the risk of climate change in the coming years.
Brian Mullen, Global News. On today's announcement, strict limits on bonuses and share buybacks is not the same as stopping them. What specific safeguards will be in place to ensure companies don't take advantage?
We will be working very closely with different companies across different sectors to determine the right frame that is right for their industry and business. But Canadians expect that if we're putting public dollars to support financing for companies, that the money goes to support workers. That is the approach with the large employers emergency financing facility. We need to support workers, and that's not shareholders through dividends. That's not executive bonuses. That is ensuring that everything they're doing is protecting workers, their pensions, their collective bargaining, and the continued operation of this company in the country.
If there aren't safeguards in place, will you consider putting some in place?
I think that is part and parcel of the discussions that we'll have before implementing the LEAF program. We need to make sure that the money is going to support workers every step of the way. We have
to ensure that the money we give to big businesses is there to help employees, not the executives and not the investors, but the workers in these companies. And that is why we will set up measures to ensure that our support is there to support workers, their pensions, and the respect of their collective agreements. All of those elements for these major employers who employ millions throughout the Canada will be necessary if they want to be able to receive these public funds.
From CTV National News. How much is the government willing to spend on these checks to these major companies? And is the government taking on too much risk in this time of a pandemic when we don't know how long it's going to go on for?
I think the significant risk is that we see long-term damage to the Canadian economy, that we see significant large companies that employ millions of Canadians lose their existence, stop functioning because of this pandemic, and millions of Canadians lose their jobs. We need to make sure that we are supporting these employers so that Canadians can continue to have jobs once we bounce back from this pandemic. Of course, we would much prefer that people look onto the private credit markets to get the loans and bridge financing they need, but we will be there as a lender of last resort to ensure that those companies do continue to employ the Canadians across the country who depend on those jobs, but there will be significant conditions around that as well. Okay. Our priority
in the current situation is always to ensure that we're there to support the workers. That are millions working for these major employers throughout the country. So what's important is to prevent these companies from going bankrupt, and that this brings about serious damage to the Canadian economy. Obviously, we prefer that these companies find their financing on the normal markets, but if they can't get it because of the pandemic, we will be there to support them in this difficult time.
An outbreak related to a nightclub there. Obviously, we are still don't have nightclubs open here, but it does show how quickly outbreaks can happen, and they've decided to postpone opening schools. Today, schools outside of Montreal are now opening in Quebec. Are you willing to put any pressure on premiers across the country to tell them to slow down right now, given how you've said we're still in an emergency phase?
I think we're all feeling pressure from Canadians to get this right. And we understand that the sacrifices we've all made for the past 2 months of staying home, of self-isolating, of keeping 2 meters distance, of not seeing parents and grandparents, could all go up in smoke if we move too quickly on reopening, or if a given jurisdiction makes the wrong decisions. That's why being cautious and gradual and vigilant is essential for how we move forward on the gradual reopening. And that's why Canadians across the country are looking very carefully at all orders of government and the decisions they make, and will be held to account if reopening happens too quickly and Canadians have to lock down once again in a few weeks because people were overeager to get the economy going. We have to get that balance right, and that means being cautious, and we will continue to be pushing for caution as we move progressively towards reopening the economy.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau, Christian Noël de Radio-Canada.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau, Christian Noël, Radio-Canada. The assistance you're announcing today is a loan guarantee. Is this the last one for large businesses? Or, rather, for how long can the government continue supporting the economy, carrying it on their backs? We are now living a very difficult situation. We've had no experience, prior experience, that can help us figure out how to approach this. We have to make our decisions as best we can, and as we have done from the very beginning, we announce programs, and if we need to adjust them or shorten them or widen them, then we adjust accordingly. And at each step, we are guided by two basic principles. First of all, keep Canadians safe and sound, and second, allow the economy to be able to pick up fully sometime in the future. But obviously, we have to take our time and adjust as events unfold. It's a major announcement today to support large employers. It's possible that we will have other announcements to be made at the next steps, but at each step, we will want to maximize the impact of the measures that we're announcing in order to restart the economy appropriately, and that the government then be appealed to less and less as we move forward.
Throughout this pandemic, we have been guided by two strong principles. One is protect the health and safety of Canadians. And second in order of importance, is ensure that our economy is able to bounce back quickly and strongly once all this is over. That means doing things strongly right now to support people, but also make sure that there is an economy to come back to once we do start reopening and life starts to get back to normal. So what we've announced today with the large employer emergency financing facility, the LEAF, will be a significant help to significant employers right across the country. There may be more steps we have to take. We don't know what the next possible steps are that we're going to need. We're going to stay open and flexible to adjusting the programs we put forward, to stretching them out, to condensing them, to combining them. We've demonstrated every step of the way that we're figuring out what works best, and if something doesn't work great, we'll pull it back and tweak it and try and put it out in a different way. We're in an unprecedented situation, but every step of the way, we will do what is necessary to protect Canadians and to ensure that we have an economy to go back to.
J'essaie de comprendre un peu où vous êtes rendu dans votre projection d'aide.
I'm trying to understand where you are in your forecasting of assistance necessary. You talked about several $1 billion of subsidies, but today it's mainly loan and that will have to be reimbursed. Is that because you think that we're coming to the end of money available? Answer, no, it's not for that reason. Today's announcement is part of a series of measures. The first measures put forward were there to help workers who had lost their jobs. So this was money we put directly in their pockets. Then, for small businesses, we made available loans under very good conditions that cost almost nothing to help them. To mid-sized businesses get somewhat more expensive and difficult loans, and for the very large businesses, the financing will cost them even more because they have access to credit to a level that workers or even very small businesses just don't have. So to provide loans to large businesses is part of our priority, which is to support workers first off and expect that large enterprises can manage on their own as much as possible on the financial markets to which they do have access. And that is the end of the press conference for today. Thank you, everybody.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau speaking mainly today about the Large Employer Emergency Financing Facility, or LEAF, as you will hear it called. That's the new acronym for that. Companies, of course, hoping to secure financing from it must meet certain criteria, certain guidelines. We talked about that before the news conference, but the Prime Minister reiterated that. He also said this is not a blank check. This is not a bailout. This is bridge financing, and he prefers companies find private liquidity, but of course, this is a last resort for companies that have a lot of employees who still need to put food on the table. Let's bring in our David Aiken. And Trudeau was asked, David, about the oil and gas sector, if the oil and gas sector could benefit from this, because as you've been saying for weeks, the Prime Minister of the government had said there's an announcement coming in days and days. So is that announcement, or is there something extra coming?
Yeah, so I mean, we have calls out now to see if for example, organizations like the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers are okay with this. I suspect they will, that there will be major oil and gas producers who do have, believe it or not, environmental plans, sustainability plans. Remember, the province of Alberta's environment plan is in line with the federal government's plan, so much so that there's no federal carbon tax imposed on Alberta. It's different in Saskatchewan. So the province of Saskatchewan is not in line with the federal government's plan, and so the federal government imposes a carbon tax on Saskatchewan. But just thinking about those based in Alberta, up in the oil sands in Fort Mac, those companies, if they chose, could come to the government and say, we need some bridge financing. And this is not so much for employees necessarily right now. The point of the LEAF, and that's the new acronym, is to make sure that that business is there to employ people when it returns. Better example on that front might be, as I said before the press conference, a national clothing retailer. It's not an essential business. It's a clothing retailer inside a mall, so you can't do curbside pickup as we see in some provinces. So it's essentially shut down. You want to make sure that retailer is still a going concern, and it needs a loan that it's going to maybe look to the federal government for. And one other thing I think is important to point out here, Farah, what did the federal government do? It was the Harper government at the time in 2008 and 2009. It took an equity stake in an auto firm, GM, when auto firms were having so much trouble. So in other words, the taxpayer actually became part of an owner. That was an option, or remains an option, for the current federal government. Do we want the federal government to take an ownership stake and say, the various airlines, various retailers, oil and gas firms? The government clearly saying, no, that's not the option it wants to take right now. Instead, it's asking individual firms who can't get money from their bank, come see us. You're going to have to show us your financial structure. Can be no share buyback programs, no dividends can be paid out. You can't be increasing CEO pay. But if you're ready to do what it takes to make sure the business is going to be there for post-pandemic, then we're ready to talk.
Yeah, I just want to note about retail. You mentioned retail, and we saw J. Crew, we saw Neiman Marcus south of the border. Both of them went under because of all of this and potentially what's been going on before. But let's talk about those conditions that you mentioned, because I really liked Global News producer Brian Mullen's question. He asked about putting safeguards on dividends and share buybacks.
Right. So again, my sense, and again, details still sound like they very much be worked out. But when every company is going to be different. So let's take a national hotel chain, for example. We know, I think Marriott, there's a hotel chain that says its average room revenue was down 90% because nobody's staying in hotels. So let's say a hotel chain says, I still got to pay a mortgage. I still got to pay interest on the mortgage. I still got to keep up the properties. All those things I need money for. I have no revenue. So let's say the hotel chain comes to the government and would work out a very specific deal. And at that time, that's when the government would say, okay, a hotel chain owner, I want to make sure you're not doing this, not paying back dividends. You've never been a tax evader. Remember, it's legal in Canada to try to avoid tax. It's illegal to evade tax. Key distinction. In any event, the point of Brian's question, I think, is, if I read between the lines, is to say that each company is going to be a little bit different. each company is going to have to commit to different things. One of the questions that Finance Minister Bill Morneau got asked this morning, and I'd like to hear more about this, is what about telling taxpayers about these deals? In other words, if you do a deal with the hotel chain, will we get to know what that deal is? Typically, when the government lends money to a big company, it doesn't tell us the conditions. This has been the history of Bombardier, for example, all through the years. We know that the Bombardiers got federal money. We've never known the conditions. We don't even know if Bombardier repaid the federal taxpayer. So I think one of the key things going forward is going to be, you need to tell us about the deals, and we need to know if people repaid them. We need to know how much individual firms got, not just ballpark how much this whole program cost.
Yeah, certainly interesting to hear him talk about the conditions, tell the public about those conditions. Thanks for that, David. I want to bring in Mike Drolet now, because the other thing that was talked about and the questions that were asked was about testing. Testing is such a huge part of the solution in terms of reopening the economy, and it's been critical, of course, to limiting the spread. Ontario has been one of the places that's been criticized most for their low testing numbers. So where does the province stand today, and what are the challenges in Ontario?
Well, there's a lot of challenges with testing, not just in Ontario, but the rest of Canada. Theresa Tam has said that she wants to see 60,000 tests a day. So far, we're averaging about 25,000 tests a day within the entire country. The high was 42,000 in just a single day. That's still far shy of what Theresa Tam would like to see. Here in Ontario, yesterday there were 17,000 tests. On Friday, 19,000 tests. So they have ramped up testing, and they've increased it so then they can monitor better how this virus is spreading. But clearly it's not the same in every province. Different, like Quebec and Ontario have far more cases, so need to test a lot more than say, Prince Edward Island or even British Columbia. But testing is going to be the key. We saw in Korea that there was a case where, because they're able to monitor people better, there was somebody who went into a nightclub who had COVID-19, and that raised alarm bells. Oh, geez, what are we going to have to do with that? That's one of the things they're trying to avoid. They want to be able to control this as we slowly reopen this economy.
Yeah, it's testing, and then it's contact tracing, and the Prime Minister was asked specifically, what the government can do, or is enough testing being done? And he says it's not, but still there seems to be a disconnect, Mike, because everyone's saying there's not enough testing, but how do you build more capacity and more testing? Is the healthcare system just missing the mark here?
Well, we've heard about different places where they are doing testing and they're seeing fewer people coming through to get tested. Is that a sign that there are fewer cases out there? Possibly, we just don't know. But the key is that they have to, and when they do talk about the number of tests that we've had, that's not a number of people who have been individually tested. That's not 60,000 Canadians. That's people who have been tested before as well. So the number is a little bit misleading in that respect. The other problem with the testing is that it's a really imperfect situation, because you get tested and then it takes a couple of days to be able to get the results back. So what happens in those 2 days? Is that person going into quarantine? Is that person out in the community possibly spreading it to other people? You don't know. It's a very imperfect situation right now, and it really does give you a benchmark in terms of where we were a few days ago. So we might have had 17,000 tests in Ontario yesterday, but we're not going to find out about those cases until tomorrow or the day after.
Yeah, certainly. And then you talk about, you and I both know people who are asymptomatic, who have tested positive for COVID. So the amount of people that aren't going to get testing. The other thing that I know on Twitter, as I was watching the conversation while the Prime Minister was talking, was also about antibody testing. Now that's, of course, a long time to come. But the other issue is contact tracing. We've seen apps used in other parts of the world in terms of contact tracing. Do we know how that's going to happen here?
Well, Jeff Semple did a whole piece on that yesterday for the New Reality on Global, and it's been very effective other places in the world. The problem is here in Canada, our privacy laws are much stricter, similar to what they have in Europe as well, where it's not possible to be able to put an app on somebody's phone and be able to trace where they've gone. I mean, if you think about how this has gone from the beginning here in Canada, people coming into Canada who had to quarantine for 14 days coming from another country, do we really know that they were quarantining for those 14 days? There's really no entire way to know for sure. So to be able to put apps on people's phone, that's not going to happen here in Canada. So we have to figure out some other way to be able to track people who've had COVID-19 and tested positive for it.
And also, Mike, I mean, rely on honesty of people, like you said, to stay home, to know that that this spread, that's not just about them, it's about other people. And of course, we've seen in long-term care homes are most vulnerable who are really being impacted by this. Mike Drolet in Toronto, thanks so much. Now, to recap for you just about what the Prime Minister spoke about, this is the Large Employer Emergency Financing Facility, or LEAF, that you're going to start hearing more about. It was announced by the Prime Minister this morning. Companies that will receive the support will be expected to make certain commitments. They'll have to maintain job and investment and sharing how they plan to manage the risk of climate change. We also know that CEO salaries, that's going to be part of it. They're going to look at that. They're going to look at dividends. And the Prime Minister has said these are bridge loans. They are not bailouts. This is not a blank check. He also promises strict limits on dividends, again, buybacks and executive compensation. The Prime Minister also noted this money has to be used to pay employees, not executives. You can find full details on our website, globalnews.ca, or on Global National. I'm Farah Nasser. Thanks so much for watching. We now return you to your regularly scheduled programming.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being with us today. To all healthcare workers on the front lines, we recognize that it hasn't been easy for you. This is National Nurses Week, and we'd like to thank nurses across Canada who do exceptional work every day, particularly in the fight against this pandemic. Thank you for everything you do to keep us healthy and safe. You are our real heroes.
So, to all of Canada's frontline healthcare workers, we know that this is a particularly challenging time. This is National Nursing Week. And I'd like to thank all of the nurses across Canada who are doing exceptional work every day, and in particular during this fight against the global pandemic. Thank you for everything that you do to keep us safe and healthy. You are true heroes, and we appreciate it so much. So today we will hear from Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, the Deputy Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Howard New, the President
of the Treasury Board, Mr. Duclos.
Patty Haidu is here to answer your questions as well. Dr. Tam, please.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone.
With the latest numbers on COVID-19 in Canada. There are now 69,156 confirmed cases, including 4,906 deaths, and over 32,400, or 47%, have now recovered. Labs across Canada have tested over 1,118,000 people for COVID-19 to date, with about 6% of these testing positive. In the past week, we've tested an average of 26,000 people daily. These numbers change quickly and are updated regularly on canada.ca/coronavirus. We are at the start of another week after celebrating our mothers and caregivers, whether with us in our home, just a virtual connection away, or beloved and unforgettable in our memories. We all share the understanding of the power of their nurturing. So my weekend reflection was on the fundamental human need for this most powerful force of good. Nurturing is that silent catalyst that speeds up the healing of our cuts and scrapes, calms our fears, and gives us reassurance that everything will be okay. This brings me to a very special week of recognition and acknowledgement of some of the other important nurturers in our society. Today marks the beginning of National Nursing Week. We all know that nurses deliver expert care with that special power of nurturing, and we have been very aware of the many sacrifices they have made to be there for their patients in every area of healthcare during this crisis. But their expertise and impact goes far beyond this, spanning every area of health services, from education to the development of standards and guidelines, the delivery of public health programs like vaccination, the implementation of infection prevention and control, and contributing to research and innovation. Nurses contribute to wellness everywhere, and we are also very much better for it. So this week, let's all thank Canada's nurses. Join a 7 p.m. cheer from your driveway. Draw a thank you sign for healthcare heroes in your community, or shine a light in a window for all nurses on Tuesday night, because Tuesday nurses everywhere are commemorating the 200th anniversary of the birth of Florence Nightingale, who revolutionized the field of nursing. It was a revolution that started small, implementing hand washing and hygiene practices to save lives by preventing the spread of life-threatening infections. Then slowly, but with unshakable purpose, she raised the standards and profile of nursing and put an indelible focus on the education of nurses. So in appreciation for the nurturing, daily sacrifices, deep expertise, and unshakable professionalism of nurses everywhere, shine a light in your window on Tuesday night. Thank you. Merci.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tam. Et maintenant, je donne la parole à Dr.
And now I give the floor to Dr. New. Thank you. Hello. As usual, I'll start with the latest numbers on COVID-19 in Canada. There are now 69,156 confirmed cases, including 4,906 deaths and 3,100 and roughly 47% now recovered. Labs across Canada have tested over 1,118,000 people for COVID-19, with about 6% of these roughly testing positive. In the last week, we've tested on average 26,000 people daily. These numbers change quickly and are updated regularly on canada.ca/coronavirus. We are at the start of another week after celebrating our mothers and caregivers. Whether with us in our home, just a virtual connection away, or beloved and unforgettable in our memories, we all share the understanding of the power of their nurturing. So my weekend reflection was on the fundamental human need for this most powerful force of good. Nurturing is that silent catalyst that speeds up the healing of our cuts and scrapes, calms our fears, and gives us reassurance that everything will be okay. This brings me to a very special week of recognition and acknowledgement as some of the other important nurturers in our society. Today marks the beginning of National Nursing Week. We all know that nurses deliver expert care with that special power of nurturing, and we have been very aware of the many sacrifices they have made to be there for their patients in every area of healthcare during this crisis. However, their expertise and impact goes far beyond this, spanning every area of health services, from education to the development of standards and guidelines, the delivery of public health care programs like immunization, the implementation of infection prevention and control, and contributing to research and innovation. Nurses contribute to wellness everywhere, and we are all so much better for it. So this week, let's all thank Canada's nurses. Join a 7 p.m. cheer from your driveway. Draw a thank you sign for healthcare heroes in your community. Or shine a light in a window for all nurses on Tuesday night. Why Tuesday? Because nurses everywhere are commemorating the 200th anniversary of the birth of Florence Nightingale, who revolutionized the field of nursing. It was a revolution that started small, implementing hand washing and hygiene practices to save lives by preventing the spread of life-threatening infections. Then slowly, but with unshakable purpose, she raised the standards and profile of nursing and put an indelible focus on the education of nurses. So, in appreciation for the nurturing, daily sacrifices, deep expertise, and unshakable professionalism of nurses everywhere, shine light in your window on Tuesday night. Thank you.
Merci, Dr. New. Et maintenant, je donne
Thank you, Dr. New. And now I give the floor to Mr. Duclos. Thank you, Christian. Hello, everyone. The Prime Minister's main message today was about protection, keeping people safe, and also establishing a new credit program for large corporations. It is to protect workers and to ensure that their collective agreements are respected, and it is an investment plan to guarantee jobs, given the situation we're living through. And second, we want to establish a solid mechanism, given the situation we're facing, for landowners and managers. We want to avoid companies from going bankrupt. We want to ensure their pension plans are properly managed. And also, we want to protect the resilience of our economy when we do restart our economy. And we hope this will be lasting, and we need to ensure that large corporations will be supported, but we'll show that they're fighting climate change and have solid environmental measures in place. And they have to guarantee that they're maintaining supply chains, and also with small and medium-sized companies. They are the very fabric of our economy. So all of this is part of the emergency plan that is both fair and transparent and universal. Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you very much, Jean-Yves. We're happy to answer your questions now. Thank you.
Just a reminder that we have a hard stop at 1 p.m. today, so we'll start on the phone with 3 questions, 1 question, 1 follow-up, and then we'll turn to the room. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Our first question, notre première question, nous vient de l'inaudible avec la presse canadienne. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Oui, bonjour.
Hello, Mr. Duclos. Can you explain the logic behind this support for large corporations and the airline sector, for example? We know that their medium or short-term future may be difficult given the situation. What guarantees can you give that all this money that is going to be spent on these companies and keeping them afloat won't just be for naught, because they will be doing layoffs, they've had to cut business? Answer. These are emergency loans. They're not blank checks. So these loans will be offered to ensure that we can support a transition from this crisis to avoid some of these large corporations from having to shut their doors and lay off thousands of workers. And they won't have to also cut supply chains that are very important between these large corporations and small and mid-sized companies. As I said, they are the very fabric of our economic growth and economy in Canada, and notably in Quebec. So we have to ensure that we protect our economic fabric throughout this crisis, which we need to restart our economy. And we know that this involves notably an emergency loan plan for some of these large corporations. It's not a blank check, and In most cases, these large companies will prefer to continue to get liquidity from traditional financial markets, but they should be able to turn to Canadian government in some conditions, but there will be requirements that will be in place. Question. Thank you. I understood that these were loans, Mr. Duclos, but I'd like for you to explain what will be happening for airlines. Will government be giving companies funding to airlines? We've seen automotive companies that did not pay back government loans. What is the logic behind helping these companies financially, particularly airlines, when we know that in the short and medium term and even the longer term, that they will have less and less business? Answer. One thing that is clear that you're saying very well, in the short term, we know very well that these airlines will continue to see sizable losses. But we know in the longer term, we will need solid airlines in Canada. And from a structural and a national perspective, these airlines and transporters in general will play a major role to protect the fabric of our Canadian economy. And it is very important to protect airlines and transporters in Canada. We need them to be solid so that one day we'll be able to get out of this crisis. Thank you. Next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, nous vient de Ryan Tumulty avec le National Post. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Yeah, hi there. This question's for Dr. Tam or perhaps Minister Hajdu. I'm working on a story, and I've been talking to people in the health industry here about Canada's ability to produce large quantities of vaccine when or if one is found for COVID-19. I'm wondering if that's a concern for you, if you think the resources are here. I know Canada does produce a lot of vaccine, but those markets are, those factories are already full of other orders.
Well, thank you very much for the question. And in fact, that's part of the work that we've been doing in terms of working with promising companies across the country, particularly when it comes to vaccine production. Certainly, we have a ways to go. As you know, there is quite a bit of work to do in the space of vaccine creation and then production, but that is certainly something that we're working on. And my colleague, Minister Baines, has been extremely active in this space, making sure that Canadian companies who have either the capacity or the desire to do that have the supports from our government to quickly ramp up. Maybe I'll turn to Dr. Tam to speak a little bit more about where the international community is at in terms of vaccine development.
Well, I think we're still in this sort of relatively early stage where there's a lot of research, which is great news. So I would say over 100 sort of different candidates being looked at right now as potentials, some going into sort of early stage clinical trials. So it is still early stage. But nonetheless, we are engaging all the capacities in Canada to have a look at what is in the realm of the possible. So you don't actually have a sort of lead candidate vaccine yet, but we are absolutely monitoring every one of these and looking at domestic capabilities linked to it. So it is a very rapidly evolving setting, but we're also looking at all the way downstream to, well, when you actually have to vaccinate the population, you have to look at all the supply. So really the whole pipeline from beginning to end is being looked at from a preparedness perspective. But right now, you can't actually say, here is the vaccine that is going to be the most successful. That is still undergoing evolution globally, but we're part of that research internationally. So I think, I think we need to look at every option. Some of the investments that Canada puts in may not pan out to be, in the end, a successful candidate, but we still need to contribute right now and maximize all of our options.
Ryan, follow up?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask too, when I spoke with people in the industry, they say, for example, Canada makes most of its own flu vaccine every year, but there's obviously, well, only about 40% of Canadians get the flu vaccine, so this order would be presumably much larger, but also those factories are tied up making that flu vaccine. I'm wondering if, as a public health measure, you'd consider reducing the amount of flu vaccine we make one year to be able to make more COVID vaccine, should we get there, obviously.
I think, it's dangerous to think about things in a zero-sum way like that. I think we can't keep our eye off influenza as highly contagious and also leading to thousands of deaths across Canada. And of course, coincidement of the flu season with a second spike of COVID, for example, could be very difficult for our healthcare system. So from my perspective as health minister, I don't think what we would want to be in the position of having to do is decrease the production of an extremely valuable, extremely important vaccine to increase the production of another. What we're looking to do is expand the capacity and have companies across Canada that can produce, the potential COVID vaccine. I'll also just point out that I think it's really important that we work with the international community on the COVID vaccine. As we know, no country is safe as long as there is one case of COVID, and so Canada has been aggressively working in partnership and including contributing financial resources to the acceleration of discovering a vaccine and the eventual production of one.
I would just add that it's not a very simple analysis, because the COVID-19 vaccine, whichever is a potential candidate, may not be grown on the same platform as the influenza vaccine. So, for example, if you have an egg-based influenza vaccine platform, that might not be how your COVID-19 vaccine is going to be produced. So it depends on the technology as well.
Thank you, Dr. Operator. Next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, nous vient de Raymond Filion avec TVA. Please go ahead. Your line is now open. À vous la parole.
Good afternoon. I have a question for Mr. Duclos. I'd like to follow up on a question that was asked earlier by a colleague to the Prime Minister about the easing of the lockdown. In case of doubt, should we stay at home? Do we have doubts about security? And if I do, and I don't want to go to work, can I continue to receive the CERB? Answer. We are in a question where there are big doubts and safety is at question. There are a lot of households, and this is on the mind of many workers. There are basic rules. We have to have a good relationship with our worker, and in appropriate cases, we may need help from public officials in provinces so that we can allay fears and by working with employers. That's the main objective. We want to ensure the safety of workers and also the feeling they have of being safe at work. A large part of our individual well-being depends on our well-being at work. And in this difficult context, which creates both doubts and insecurity, workers need to be supported by their workers, and they expect appropriate measures in this work situation. Question. If the school or the factory where I work opens its doors, I have to reach an agreement with my employer. But at the end of the line, who knows if I'm eligible for the CERB if I refuse to go to work because I don't think it's safe and I have fears? Answer. You say it quite correctly. If I feel that there are health and safety issues at work, I also have the responsibility to talk about this with my employer and to talk about with health officials and experts. If the response is not as satisfactory as I want as a worker, if the basic condition and the employer-employee relationship, it should be done correctly. In that case, the CERB is there to help and support millions of workers financially who do not have the ability to be at work safely with what I've just said, or if they have to take care of a child at home, or if they've lost their job because of COVID-19. Thank you very much. A question from a room now.
Mr. Hajdu, we just had Mental Health Week, and I'm wondering, how concerned are you about a secondary mental health like echo pandemic that could happen because of all this?
Well, thank you very much, Mike. And it's a great question. We did just have Mental Health Week, and we know that it's not just a secondary wave. It's actually happening right now, that many Canadians are experiencing distress in proportions that we haven't seen in a very long time, whether it's anxiety or depression, increased domestic violence, increased substance use. And that's why we've been so focused on making sure that we don't wait until the resolution of the pandemic to provide resources, but rather they're available right now. And I've talked quite a bit about those resources. I'll just remind Canadians that you can have access to free support through the Wellness Together portal available through canada.ca/coronavirus. But also that site has a number of useful self-assessment tools, resources that you can use on your own, and then connections to paid professionals, whether it's by text or phone. We've also increased money to transfer to provinces and territories, and for both treatment, by the way, as well as mental health supports. And that's in addition to our previous contribution through transfer increases in the last mandate. But there will be more to do, and we know that this secondary pandemic, if you will, is just as in many ways. As a matter of fact, I would say it's just as urgent as this one, because of course people are struggling for a whole bunch of reasons, including our young people, and we need to be all focused at every level of government to help people manage through these difficult times.
Thank you. And you talked about the Wellness Together portal, and I'm just wondering, does it have enough supports there? Do we need to do other stuff? Is there enough funding? Is there anything else we could do better?
Mm-hmm. So far, I've heard good things about the Wellness Together portal, and I know that provinces and territories also have their own digital and online tools, as well as access through a variety of different means to professionals in their own jurisdictions. I think there's always more to do to understand what's working and what's not working, and I think the challenge, having come from this sector in some ways in my past, the challenge is that oftentimes there isn't the diversity of tools available for people. For example, the way that we treat substance use is pretty standard, and there are a few different versions of ways to treat substance use, but there's not the variety that exists that necessarily meets people where they're at. And that work has to continue. And I'm looking forward to having those more fulsome conversations with other provinces, with territories, with providers, about how we can all do a better job talking about mental health and mental wellness. I think we also have to, as a society, continue to work on breaking down barriers to talk about mental health in a way that doesn't create that barrier of stigma that still exists for people to talk about how they're feeling. I mean, many people are feeling sad and lonely and scared, and those are okay feelings and very normal feelings to have. And so I think we have to continue to encourage one another to reach out and to speak to our families, our friends, and professionals when we need to. Thank you.
Rachel?
Rachel Haynes from CTV National News. My first question is for Minister Hajdu and Dr. Tam. Schools in some areas of Quebec are opening today, even though the numbers there are still relatively high. How concerned are you that kids right now are going to be used as guinea pigs in this reopening that we're seeing, and does that concern you?
Well, I think as we've all said, and all the chief medical officers agree, you have to do things slowly and cautiously. So I think the Quebec public health authorities are, I'm sure, monitoring this extremely closely to see what the initial school opening would be like from a COVID-19 perspective. But as we just talked about mental health and other aspects of secondary effects, they're also monitoring, that side of things too, not just illness. And it's a complex piece of decision making, but also it's in some ways, have to support parents and individuals for making that decision, and also teachers. And so kids are connected to teachers and their families could be connected to grandparents, for example. So individual situations of risk, I think, are actually a bit different, and that needs to be looked at a more local level. But for sure, I think we know that children on the whole, particularly younger kids, do exhibit milder symptoms and have less of a severe outcome. So I think that goes into one aspect of it, but it is I know is a balancing between that and the need for kids, particularly vulnerable kids. I think that's, I know that in the public health domain, people are concerned that closing down schools can only impact those most vulnerable the most. So those are the kids, I think, that they're most seized with. The other thing is that children of essential service workers as well that need maybe some support from a school perspective.
Okay. Minister, Harder, do you have anything to add?
I think Dr. Tam's covered it well. Thanks.
And as a follow-up too, we are seeing some very large cities that are opening up, like Toronto, for some curbside pickup. But there are still, again, high number of cases there, more so than in other places of the country where they are not reopening yet. Even New Brunswick had pushed back some days of school opening. So are you concerned about this perhaps imbalance of openings that we're seeing across the country?
Well, thank you very much. I think that each jurisdiction is using the guidance framework that the provinces and territories with the Prime Minister worked out to make their own jurisdictional decisions based on the complexity of considerations that Dr. Tam has outlined. These are difficult decisions, and of course, premiers and local politicians are weighing decisions about how to resume some functioning of their communities while also protecting people's wellness. And I think, as Dr. Tam's talked about, the decisions are being driven through epidemiology that's very local in its context and through a risk assessment process at the provincial level. And I think when Dr. Tam talked a couple weeks ago about the downside, coming down the curve, coming down the peak, I think that's where we're at. I think all premiers and all municipal leaders understand that there will be a period of adjustment and that we will have to be taking these decisions, carefully monitoring the outcomes of these decisions and adjusting them. And I think we can anticipate that there will be adjustments as we go through the next phase. Because, of course, this is a whole new way of behaving, not just for leaders, but also for the citizens that live in those communities. I think there are some very simple messages that Canadians can take with them always, no matter which jurisdiction, which is wash your hands, don't go anywhere if you're sick, and make sure you keep your distance, your 2-meter distance from people, and give people distance when you're out in the community. And I think that will help also to reduce risk for community. Thank you.
Tonda? Good morning. Minister Freeland, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, on Friday was very adamant. He doesn't want to see the U.S. border reopened anytime soon. Can you address his concerns about that, and given that the agreement, I guess, comes up in a week? And very specifically, he said, and if you go about relaxing restrictions at borders for travel, there needs to be tenfold screening at airports and whatnot. So what plan has your government got in place to address those concerns?
Thanks for the question, Tonda. We had a very good conversation with the premiers on Thursday at the now weekly First Minister's call about borders in general and the Canada-US border in particular. We are really daily, even hourly, reviewing and working on and monitoring the border situation with our U.S. partners. The Prime Minister was very clear today, as he is every day, that we believe in acting out of an abundance of caution, that we believe it's very important not to squander the gains that Canadians have sacrificed so much to achieve. And we are going to be taking that prudent and careful approach when it comes to reviewing our border agreement with the United States. The premiers, very much including Premier Ford, offered some very useful input in the conversation on Thursday, and we're having ongoing conversations with the Americans.
I'm not sure that was an answer, but okay.
Yeah, no, Tonda, actually, that was an answer. What I said was that we are working closely with the Americans, that we're taking a cautious and careful approach. And we had a great and very useful conversation with the premiers who, by and large, share this cautious view.
So is there a need for tenfold increase in screening at borders, as Premier Ford said?
When it comes to the second part of your question, actual measures that are in place at the border, Right now, the situation is working well. In fact, I think particularly at the Canada-US border, the distinction between essential and non-essential travel has managed to achieve our two objectives of keeping Canadians safe and at the same time allowing those essential goods and services to continue moving freely across the border. So that has worked and that is working. Of course, inevitably, as our economy starts to open up, something that we've been talking about today, even absent a single change in Canada's border restrictions, we will see more travel across the border. We'll see more Canadians choosing to go back and forth, and we'll see more business activity, which will mean more essential travel. And that does mean that the federal government will need to do even more at all of our borders to keep Canadians safe and well. And that is something that we are working on right now and we're very focused on.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. We'll now go back to the phone for 3 questions. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question nous vient de Hélène Buzetti avec Le Devoir. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Duclos. Good afternoon, Mr. Duclos. I'd like to go back about the question you were asked earlier. My colleague from TVA asked you about something. We're restarting the economy. There are employers that are calling their workers back, and in some cases, workers don't think things are safe. I understand that you are trying to encourage a conversation between employers and employees about work safety, but if they don't reach a mutual understanding and the worker still doesn't want to go back to work, should they receive the CERB or not? Answer. Thank you for your question. The CERB is there to help workers in 3 types of circumstances. First, if the worker has lost their job because of COVID-19. Second, if this person needs to take care of a child at home. And third, if this person needs help to ensure their health and safety. And that is what the employer-worker relationship reposes on. The employer has the responsibility not only to guarantee the health and safety of the worker at their normal workplace, but also they have to ensure that that worker has the feeling and the reassurance of safety and that their health will also be protected. In all cases, this reassurance and this feeling depends on an important conversation between the worker and the employer. And as I said, this conversation may need to be supported by directives and additional information from health officials and health and safety officials across the country and notably in Quebec. So it really depends on an individual context. Question. You're still not answering my question, so I'm not going to lose my time talking more about that. But I'd like to hear what you have to hear about the student CERB. The bill was adopted almost 2 weeks ago. There's a certain amount of latitude being taken. We've heard that students will be given available jobs and that they'll be able to earn a certain amount of money and still receive this assistance. Do you have anything more to say about that? Answer. 2 things. The emergency support for students is offered in a much broader context. There are solid measures to increase jobs available for students. Many students will have a hard time finding a job. They'd like to find one rather than receiving the CERB for students. And therefore, we established measures to support internships, volunteer work for students, so that we can support community organizations. There's the Canada Summer Job Program. So there are certain measures that will be there to enhance jobs, increase the jobs that are available, but there will still be some students that won't be able to work in coming months. So the second thing that will soon be done in cooperation with Madame Le Boutillier, the Minister of Revenue, And Ms. Qualtrough, the Minister of Employment, is to announce on a site that will be on the CERA's website will be a mechanism for that students be able to receive the student to CERB. Thank you, Minister. Next question.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, nous vient de Laura Osman with the Canadian Press. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Good afternoon. This question is for, I think, Minister Hajdu and perhaps Dr. Tam. Some experts have expressed some concerns about the way Canada gathers important health data, particularly related to deaths that could be causing a delay in getting important epidemiological data, like excess deaths, for example. Death certificates are done on paper in some areas. So why is this process so behind in Canada, and is it hindering Canada's ability to gather that important data that other countries seem to have ready access to?
Yes, so we are in the process of looking at that kind of data with Statistics Canada because it's not just about COVID-19 deaths. It's also looking at some of the other impacts. So that is actually something that is taking place. As well, we are in contact with coroners and medical examiners to look at what they can contribute to as well. We started that, building that capacity as part of our ongoing crisis in terms of drug-related poisonings and overdoses. So we are going to try and link with that platform as well. But it's a very important point, and there's a number of pieces of data that we're looking at right now to look at those in parallel or unintended consequences.
Laura, follow up.
Thank you. Other countries seem to have a more automated process for getting this kind of information. Is Canada's platform sort of behind the times on this?
Well, I think we have highlighted some of the gaps in sort of real-time information on the COVID-19 deaths themselves. So I think we are doing our very best with the provinces to try and see if we can address those gaps. So I think that's clear, particularly in the area of disaggregated analysis that we've already talked about, I think in the last several days. So that is something that we do have to work with. But I think with Statistics Canada, we'll look at some of the other statistical analyses. And, I think it's interesting in that the reporting of deaths is actually not that real time overall when you consider the fact that that's a very specific outcome. But it's something that we're looking at to see if there's different ways in which we can address that. But I think excess mortality is something that we have to look at right now in parallel with the COVID-19 deaths.
Thank you, Dr. Operator. Next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, is from Alex Bollingal with the Toronto Star. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I think it's for Minister Hajdu. We've seen, based on an analysis by some of my colleagues in Toronto, that in Ontario, private or for-profit long-term care homes have had significantly more deaths from COVID-19 than public ones. I'm wondering what you think of that, and if in the reviews of our long-term care system and how we care for vulnerable people in Canada, if looking at changing the way that for-profit care is allowed, whether that would be bringing it into the public system, if that's something that you think should be looked at and done.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. And I think I've been really clear that there is this health crisis has really shone a light on some particular vulnerabilities in long-term care. And obviously, data is starting to emerge about certain characteristics of long-term care that have created even more risk for people that live there. I think our government is very open to reviewing how long-term care is delivered in this country and working with provinces and territories to strengthen quality of life and safety for seniors that live in congregate living settings. And I would say all congregate living settings, although there's a heavy focus on long-term care, there are other groups of individuals that live in congregate settings that also are vulnerable and have in some cases, substandard care. I'm thinking people with disabilities, for example, or other special needs that may be supported in group settings. But in particular, in terms of long-term care, I don't think there is a minister amongst us that would disagree that we need to do a better job and that the federal government can play some leadership role in this. And we are having those conversations as we speak. How we, not only in terms of how we renew that system in the future, but also how we better support long-term care right now, regardless of how that care is delivered or under what model, to ensure that seniors are safer in their homes.
Alex, follow up?
Yeah, just does that what those discussions include looking at bringing them into public health care or bringing them out of the Canada Health Act? I know the NDP leader is calling for that. Would that be something that you guys are looking at?
I think right now the first focus is to get through the crisis and protect seniors who are in these homes, regardless of the model, in a much more robust way, working in partnership with provinces and territories. And that's exactly what we've been doing, as you know, whether it's through support through human resources. The military is actively involved, as you know. We're working with the Red Cross and supporting the Red Cross to deliver services through the provision of personal protective equipment or helping care homes to acquire personal protective equipment, etc. I think the longer conversation is what do we need to do collaboratively with provinces and territories to move from a place of guidelines to a place of standards. And I think that's the important conversation that needs to happen. I would say right now we are so focused on the urgent, immediate need to save lives in these places that we are not having the fulsome conversations about how to reform the system, but it's certainly on our mind. And I know that it's on the minds of the premiers of the provinces and territories as well, because as I said in my first response, this COVID crisis has shone a light in an area that needs dramatic reform.
Thank you, Minister. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse pour aujourd'hui.
This ends our press conference for today. Thank you.